Can't hear you.
Unmute.
There you go.
My name is Fabian Wallace-Stephens. I'm a researcher at the RSA, the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Commerce and Manufacturers. Bit of a mouthful, that's why we abbreviate it to RSA. But we're a think tank and social change organisation based in London. And within that organisation, I work within the Future Work Centre, and essentially all the work we're doing here is about trying to provide decision makers, be that people in government, be that businesses, be that educators, with the kind of insights that they need to help prepare today's workforce for tomorrow's workplace. So, essentially, we like to think that we're helping try to enable good work in what might be a kind of age of disruptive innovation. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about a new piece of research that we published last week. And essentially in that piece of work, we set out 4 scenarios for how the world of work might play out leading up to 2035. And the scenarios were based with like a lot of UK context in mind, but definitely the things that you see happening, I think, are relevant for most developed economies, both in the US and across Europe. So hopefully this will be really interesting for everyone. Anyway, I'll just jump into into the into our method, and then I'll talk a little bit about the scenarios. So I guess the standard fare from think tanks and consultancies is to put out a kind of prediction about the number of jobs that are at risk of automation. And these predictions range from 35% to 5%, depending on who you agree. Essentially, they range from comforting to discerning. So whether you're a techno-optimist or you love doom and gloom, there is something out there for everyone. We wanted to do something different. We think that the crude numerical predictions that most people are putting out, they don't really capture the kind of complexity and uncertainty at play here. So there's so many things that could play out differently. One, you've got the case of, will technologies develop at kind of the pace that they've been anticipated to? Will AI live up to the hype, or will it largely just be advanced data analytics? Could someone mute that? Can hear some feedback. Thanks. Yeah, so one of the uncertainties is how these technologies develop. Another is how they'll be adopted, whether there's be a public backlash or regulatory hurdles. And then these kind of technological drivers also interact with a range of other social and economic drivers, and that will influence what the future looks like. So the scenario planning approach, we left our crystal balls at home, and we thought, we can't predict the future. There's too much uncertainty here. But what we can do is use this method to provide decision makers with a tool to prepare themselves for multiple eventualities. And so a few things that make our scenarios distinct to some of the other research you might find on the future of work is, one, we look beyond automation and AI and consider quite a broad range of technologies, and also a broad range of the ways that they impact labor markets. So, for example, our scenarios consider how technologies such as the Internet of Things might lead to an increase in workplace monitoring. And some prime examples of these is the Fitbit that Amazon has patented that buzzes when workers don't stack shelves in a correct way in their warehouses. Another example you might be more familiar with is gig platforms and how they act as brokers, being able to sort of disrupt the way that work is packaged up. And this is essentially we know that gig platforms wouldn't be possible without the powerful algorithms that underlie them, that enable them to hyper efficiently manage supply and demand way better than a standard employer would. Deliveroo, for example, is a case of re-intermediation. So it's not actually they're not actually disintermediating the supply chain, removing intermediaries. They're actually re-entering that supply chain and saying, because we have these powerful big data algorithms, we can manage supply and demand way more efficiently than restaurants previously would have been able to. And that means we can actually add an extra step into the supply chain to make it more efficient rather than take a step away, which has historically been the case and often is the case with other platforms like eBay. As I said previously, these scenarios really factor in technological adoption and how technologies diffuse. So will we ever see driverless cars on the road, or will they be confined to controlled environments? Will they ever pass regulatory roadblocks? Equally, they consider who it is that's adopting those technologies. So do they remain concentrated in a handful of tech giants, or are they equally dispersed across the economy, and do we see household names able to kind of fend off this impending competition? Lastly, our scenarios try to factor in the system-wide consequences. So this is the idea that perhaps technology will lower prices so much in one sector, perhaps that's consumer goods, that this will free up people's disposable income to spend elsewhere, and this will stimulate job growth in other parts of the economy. So despite sort of automation in manufacturing and logistics, what we might actually see is a growth in high touch roles, as this is where people look to channel their spare money. So the future of work could be more yoga teachers and massage therapists. And here's just a bit of an overview of the kind of broad nature of the drivers we considered. As you see there's a range of technologies, and this is only a sample of what we examined, a range of technologies, a range of factors that affect adoption, that's public attitudes, regulatory frameworks, and organizational readiness, and then a whole host of non-tech developments. So we're really interested in the future of the trade union movement here, and some of our scenarios consider complete atrophy of the trade unions, others consider kind of alternative models. So it might be that in some scenarios we see a growth in trade unions for the self-employed or gig workers, or equally we see a kind of emergence of worker tech initiatives, so new technology-based platforms that provide an alternative avenue for worker voice. And now I'm going to kind of give a quick sort of immersion in each of the four scenarios that we've developed. And the idea here is, on the screens you can see a mood board, but I'll kind of talk about some of the key features and a little bit about the causal pathways, how we come to end up in these competing visions for 2035. So the big tech economy, this is essentially where GAFA reigns supreme. And by GAFA, if you've not heard that acronym, I'm talking about Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. So technology's developed at a rapid pace here, and there's been widespread automation. So self-driving cars are pervasive across roads, and service robots have replaced manual jobs across the economy. In healthcare and hospitality, people are interacting with robots in their daily lives. A consequence of this is that unemployment and economic security have reached new highs. So in the big tech economy, people are lucky to find 20 hours a week work. The kind of upside of this is that technology has brought about significant improvements in people's quality of life. So consumer goods are cheaper than they ever have been before, and the quality of public services is vastly improved. So it isn't all doom and gloom, but the ultimate winners here are the Silicon Valley tech giants who have been able to enter into new markets. So we see Apple providing healthcare, for example, Facebook providing finance, which maybe leverages people's information about their social networks. And essentially, you might think, where is the backlash here? There is none. Partly that is to do with the fact that the tech giants are able to continue to stifle dissent using a whole range of their well-oiled PR machines, but also they have so many highly visible social projects that it seems that they are contributing a lot to society as a whole. Another factor to this kind of lack of dissent here is that actually the pace of technological change has happened so fast that it's just taken people by surprise. And you'll see that in other scenarios, people respond quite differently to similar changes. So the precision economy, here you can see, I'll talk a little bit about the kind of mood board inspiration here. So we've got Uber ratings, we've got Fitbits, I talked about earlier, we've got surveillance in the workplace, and we've got the Chinese social credit system. So essentially in this scenario, AI doesn't live up to the hype. And this has a knock-on effect in that we don't see driverless cars, we don't see robotics, as a lot of these technologies depend on that kind of sophisticated ability to navigate uncontrolled environments, which uses an element of artificial intelligence. But in this scenario, the Internet of Things has proven to be the definitive technology of the next 15 years. And this is widely adopted by businesses across the economy. So you see your household names in the UK. Could be retailers like Tesco, who have managed to fend off any impending competition from the likes of Amazon by installing sensors across their supply chain. And now they have a really, really good understanding of exactly how they can manage supply and demand, both labor and goods and inputs into the production process. So automation is quite modest in this scenario, as there's not widespread robots or driverless cars, but what does happen is workers are subject to a new level of algorithmic oversight, and we see the introduction of a rating system. So for example, take a typical retail worker. They might be wearing Fitbits on their daily shifts, which track their kind of staff activity, and that combined with some data collected through in-store sensors might be used by a manager to kind of assign a rating on how well they've performed within that shift they've just completed. A consequence of this is that we see gig platforms entering into new sectors as businesses understand exactly what skills they need, when and where. And so we might see the likes of Uber entering into retail. We're already seeing a lot of this scenario. That's the case. As I said earlier, Amazon have developed a Fitbit. We're looking at platforms like Uber. They've already have plans to enter into hospitality and security and are already managing trucking logistics in the US. So a lot of this is right here, right now. And for anyone who's come across the kind of dark satire Black Mirror, this scenario was quite influenced by some of the visions that Charlie Brooker developed there. I guess one of the few upsides here is that there's almost a sense in which this is a data meritocracy where people's performance is much more closely linked to their reward. And this kind of keeps everyone logged in and competing on the apps. So the idea here is that if your ratings are high enough, you might get some performance-related pay and maybe opportunities to progress into a better job, more so than you might in a current labour market situation where people tend to stay in mid to high roles for a much longer time. And another obvious positive impact of this scenario is that through the introduction of wearables and smart cities, this brings about significant improvements in people's quality of life. So what we see here is improvements in the quality of healthcare and also in the quality of the environment. So the next scenario, Exodus, this is arguably the most doom and gloom. So what happens here is another financial crisis hits us, one that we weren't expecting. And essentially this means that in the UK at least, we see another round of austerity measures introduced. And also, despite there being some technology available, automation is really limited because businesses are unable to invest in new technologies. There's just no money left for innovation. A consequence of this, another consequence we see is 0 hours contracts become more widespread. So these are contracts that offer workers little to no guarantees over when they'll work. And this is essentially a bid by firms to cut their costs as they look to survive. We see lots of kind of mergers and acquisitions in this scenario, as well as where some of the the big players already today. They have to kind of join in order to survive and find economies of scale. And really, this is the kind of this is the age of resentment. So many people are disgruntled with the failing economic system that they take to the streets. And so across the world, we see Gilets jaunes style protests. But then equally, a lot of people actually decide that they're going to leave the city altogether, and they look for alternative lifestyles. So a consequence of this is we see more support for localism, more support for cooperatives, and people eschewing large corporates and capitalism altogether. So this is the last scenario. This is arguably the most positive. And what we see here is we see the same sort of kind of introduction of technologies as we did in the first scenario in the big tech. But the fundamental difference here is that the public's attitude changes. So the public have more of an epiphany, and their attitudes turn sour as some of the risks become apparent. So this might be widespread job loss, this might be cybersecurity threats, this might be disturbing content on social media. And in response, the tech giants decide that they're going to self-regulate. So we kind of see this new way of being a tech company and doing tech. Automation becomes contained because businesses work with unions to adopt technology on mutually beneficial terms. So rather than automating lots of jobs, we see more augmentation of tasks. Again, unlike in the big tech economy where a lot of profits get siphoned overseas, profits get kept in the UK, and this means that there is money for consumers to spend on other goods and services, and disposable income flows into kind of high touch sectors such as care and education. A key kind of aspect of this scenario is that people place a premium on human authenticity. And so we might see like lots of jobs like, I guess people to help you manage your social media account could be a good example. But the kind of consequence of this is, as in every customer facing job, people really, really demand authenticity, that there becomes a massive increase in the amount of emotional labor that service workers have to put up with. So despite it being potentially better than some of the other scenarios, there is still this massive element of emotional labor, which would become quite emotionally demanding for a lot of workers. So I guess just to say that just to recap on the kind of scenarios before I talk a little bit about some of our emerging recommendations. What we kind of have here is 4 things. None of them are supposed to be our favorite. I guess the kind of, if I had to pick a key takeaway here, I would say what we're trying to show here is that it's too hard to predict the future, and it's uncertain, and it's also undetermined. So with the right sort of set of policy proposals, we could have a kind of a positive vision. So don't be fatalistic, because there isn't just one way the future could play out. That would be the key takeaway. And we kind of, when we talk about this next phase, or this is where we're going to be working a bit more, is developing what we call kind of a blueprint for a new social contract. And there's a kind of, and here I've outlined a few pillars of what that social contract might be. So the first is richer debates. So we hope that this report will really stimulate debates and get people to think beyond the kind of that binary of business as usual versus mass automation. Some of the ideas here in terms of what actually needs to be done, we might look at establishing sort of more research alliances between different think tanks and academics that are working in this space, having more funds sort of dedicated specifically to, I guess, creating more of a harmonized picture rather than people competing. Relevant to this as well, we might look at trying to upgrade the official metrics that we use when we kind of think about good work, which is for us is the whole kind of the telos of this almost. We're trying to enable good work in an age of radical technology. So are we actually measuring how people's lived experiences of work tend to change in terms of how much control they have over their tasks, in terms of how much security jobs offer them? There's a surprising dearth of data available on that. The next part might be ethical technology. So this is part of this is about involving almost this idea that sometimes gets exposed about kind of ethical technology. So how do we get investors to align up and invest in ethical technology? Is there a case to be made for something which is like a Hippocratic oath for developers? But also this is about getting diverse mix of people into tech roles, because there's too many. It's too much of a Silicon Valley at the moment, too much of a brotopia. Quickly, I'll just go through these last few points. So lifelong learning. On the one hand, we're putting forward ideas like personal learning accounts that are being piloted in France, and these essentially give people annual credits to spend on courses that they think are appropriate for themselves. Could be coding, it could be a new language. 21st century safety net. So this is exploring ideas like universal basic income, which the RSA has been quite influential in influencing the pilot programs that are currently and about to be taking place in Scotland. Another big idea here is around actually rebalancing the tax system. So we might start to look at trying to tax all forms of labor equally, irrespective of whether they're from a gig platform or through a standard employment contract. And we're also looking at kind of the future of worker voice. So this is about new union models. We recently ran a program called the Future Work Awards, where we showcase a range of kind of new alt union models and lots of worker tech initiatives. And yeah, lastly, it's all around regulation. So this could be around introducing a kind of GDPR type legislation to protect workers' privacy at work. Could be around upgrading competition authority to make sure that Amazon are paying their way fairly. Anyway, I feel like I've run over my allotted time slightly, so now I'm going to open it up to questions, and I can talk about some of these pillars in a little bit more detail in the Q&A.